Hi everyone, welcome to our class on neuroscience of sexuality. I'm taking a class after a long time. It's good to be back. Why is this topic important? Since the last 50 years, 100 years, there has been a constantly evolving viewpoint on sexuality, and there has been so many points of conflict of what is sexuality, what is gender identity, and even on a very day-to-day basis, the whole spectrum of male behavior, female behavior, what are men supposed to do, what are women supposed to do, this whole conversation has been a difficult one, and it has become more difficult with every added complexity. So there is social, political, there are so many different versions of this problem. To talk about neuroscience of sexuality is to talk about first the neuroscience of sex, because this is where the conversation starts from. And if you don't understand sex itself, it's difficult to understand sexuality. And here itself the challenge starts, because conversations around sex have been traditionally difficult. Even in school, in colleges, just talking about sex has always been met with resistance. And this is why, starting from there onwards, everything has become progressively more and more difficult. The traditional viewpoint of sex is that sex is an act. Sex is an act that is necessary for evolution, necessary for reproduction, propagation of species. So right from there, we can look at the idea of sex as an act which is for reproduction. And this is something that we are taught. We are taught this in school, and this is something that we all understand. The other aspect of sex is what we talk of when we mean gender. That what is your sex? So what we are actually asking is, what is your gender? So when we talk of sex, the first thing that I want to cover, for the sake of both completeness and for the fun of it, is I want to talk about the act of sex and what is the neuroscience in this. In the act of sex, there are some basic steps. You have libido, which is when there is an inherent interest in sex. Then you have arousal, the sexual act itself, and orgasm. Rats, lower animals, birds, monkeys, apes, us. The act of sex or the act of reproduction has been consistent throughout, and therefore these four things, libido, arousal, sexual act, and orgasm, has also been there throughout. Now, when human beings first started thinking about sex and thinking about what we do and why we do, there were a lot of things that we thought was quite unique to us, that this cannot happen in animals. Like, for example, right from here, the idea of orgasm. For a long time, it was thought that animals don't orgasm, but it turns out that they do. The idea of foreplay. It was thought that animals don't do it, but it turns out they do. The idea of infidelity or cheating. Apparently, animals also cheat. The idea of masturbation. Apparently, chimps also do it. Bonobo monkeys also do it. The idea of marriage, or rather monogamy. Not unique to humans. Animals also do it. The few interesting things that turns out that animals don't do much and seems to be unique to human behavior are things like sex in private, which seems like a very obvious thing, but very few animals do that. So the idea that sex is something that needs to be hidden, the idea that sex is something that should not be done in public, is quite a uniquely human idea. The overlap between sex and violence, not really seen in animals much. So that seems to be more in only in humans. The idea of fantasizing. Now this, to be fair, we are not very sure, because we can't know what an animal is thinking. But as far as we know, animals don't really fantasize. Animals react to whatever is there then and there. and they don't spend time thinking about sex or thinking about somebody when there is no stimulus. And the idea of marriage itself, because this is a social construct. So these are the fundamentals of sex. Now let's get to the brain. So in sex, in the act of sex, what happens in the brain? This is the neuroanatomy. So the neuroanatomy is that this is the brain. This is something called as the brain stem. And the brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the long piece of neuroanatomy that is running through your back, all the way from your neck right up to the butt. And there are, all throughout the spinal cord, there are things that exit the spinal cord called as nerves. And these nerves are what connects the brain and the spinal cord to the organs. Now, for this conversation on sex, there are two organs that we are interested in. One is called as the adrenal gland. I don't know how many of you have heard of the adrenal gland, but you've heard of the kidneys. There are two kidneys, one on each side. And right on top of the kidneys are these small little like crowns called as the adrenal glands. And this is connected to the brain. And secondly, you have gonads or sex organs. And this is where your difference starts. So in both men and women, you have the brain, you have the spinal cord, you have the adrenal glands. But here, when we talk of the sex organs, you start differentiating, and you can either have the testes in men or you have ovary in women. The males have testes and the females have ovaries. Now, let's take a slightly closer look at what happens in the brain. Now, there are two areas, or rather one area divided into two that I want you to know, and this is a new part. We have never spoken about this before. In the brain, there is a area called as hypothalamus. To give you context, we have spoken about the thalamus. We have talked about how the thalamus is the traffic cop, and the thalamus is where all the sensations come in and it directs all the sensations everywhere. The thalamus has nothing to do with this now, but the hypothalamus is an area just below the thalamus, and this has everything to do with sex. In fact, it is like the master controller of sex. And how does it control it? Two ways. Sex is an electrochemical process. So what do I mean by that? Electro is when you are connected through the nerves. So all your nerves and neurons in your brain talk to each other through electric conduction. So that is the electro. And chemical is the hormones. So the hypothalamus will talk to the adrenal gland and to the gonads through electrochemical routes. That means that it will either talk through nerves, which the connection is called as autonomic nervous system. And this you may have heard of, the autonomic nervous system. It contains two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and these two will keep you in balance. So these two are responsible for everything in your body, from your heart rate to your blood pressure, to your breathing, to your digestion. Everything in your body is controlled through the autonomic nervous system, and sex is no different. So everything that you require to survive is autonomic nervous system. And second is hormones. And specifically in this case, sex hormones. The sex hormones are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So the hypothalamus doesn't directly release testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Instead, what it does is it will control the release of estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone, by controlling an area right below called as the pituitary gland. And if you have heard of this, then again tell me. The hypothalamus is what controls the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is what releases all hormones in your body. So the pituitary gland is the mother gland of all your hormones. So if you've heard of the endocrine system, which is the system that connects all your hormones, it is your pituitary gland that will control everything. And your pituitary gland takes orders from your hypothalamus. So this is how your hypothalamus basically controls all the hormones and all the electric conduction. So the autonomic nervous system. So this is why the hypothalamus is considered as the master mind of everything that happens in your body. So the two main hormones that we are interested in, there's something called as FSH and LH, which is in women. And there's something called as ACTH, which is in both men and women. And your ACTH controls the adrenal gland and the FSH and LH controls the ovaries. Long story short, all of this will control estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. This is important for step 1 of sex, which is libido. If you don't have libido, you are not going to want to have sex. You are not going to be able to have sex. So these three hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, are going to, the way these hormones modulate themselves will end up with you feeling the need to have sex. Next up is arousal. And this part we have covered. When in Tanmay channel, when we talked about love, in the second part, we talked about arousal. And this is very much an autonomic nervous system process. So what happens in arousal is that, well, to put it in simple terms, you're turned on. And this happens because, one, your brain identifies somebody, and two, your body reacts. So there is an input, your brain identifies somebody that it perceives as a possible mate. It can be either a physical stimulus, it can be a mental stimulus. So in human beings, we can fantasize and get turned on. We can hear something and get turned on. We can see something. Any input that starts off that chain reaction can lead to arousal. And the physical act of arousal is completely autonomic nervous system. Now the autonomic nervous system, like I said, the parasympathetic and sympathetic. If you've seen that yin and yang picture, it is literally like that. So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic will constantly keep each other in balance. So whenever parasympathetic goes up, sympathetic goes down, or vice versa. So these two have to act in sync for anything to happen. So for your heart rate to be in balance, your blood pressure to be in balance. And especially in sex, this is very, very important, because let's take the example of a man getting turned on. So the simple act of a man getting turned on is basically the mental aspect, which is when the hormones start going up, and that we will talk about in a minute. And then there is the physical aspect, which is an erection. And just breaking it down, the complexity of what goes in an erection, the parasympathetic has to act first. There has to be increased blood flow. The sympathetic has to act to stop the blood flow from returning. Later on, when there is orgasm, it is only your sympathetic. So the act of sex can be thought about as moving from parasympathetic towards sympathetic. So when you are turned on, it is your parasympathetic, but when you are orgasming, it is your sympathetic. And this is true for women also. So the act of sex is literally a balancing act in your autonomic nervous system. And one of my favorite lines in my neurobiology, in my neuroscience textbook, was when they described, when they described orgasm as a non-pathological autonomic dysreflexia, which is a very, very confusing way of talking about an orgasm. But think about this. Autonomic dysreflexia means that your autonomic nervous system is not acting properly. So in any situation, when your autonomic nervous system acts like this, you would consider yourself to be in trouble. But in orgasm, your autonomic nervous system is acting in such a way, but it is non-pathological. So an orgasm is actually something that is a crisis, but acceptable. Now that covers the arousal and the act of sex. Why do you do it? What makes animals want to have sex? Now, we know why we want to have sex, because it feels good. So there is a fundamental choice that we make, that we feel that I want to do it. So there is a almost like a free will component to it. But we cannot leave evolution and reproduction to free will. There has to be a more fundamental drive to ensure that everybody has sex so that they reproduce, so that the species will continue. This is where your limbic system comes into play. In the brain, there is a part called as the limbic system. And your limbic system is the part that controls all your emotions. What does the limbic system have to do with sex? Two things. One, pleasure. So sex has to be pleasurable for every animal to do it. And whenever I say pleasure, I'm immediately talking about dopamine. Now, dopamine is something that is familiar to you. And this is same for both men and women. So both men and women have the same pleasure pathways. So this is pleasure and reward pathways. And to put it very simply, what happens is, in the brainstem, there is an area which releases dopamine. Dopamine comes out from the brainstem, goes up to your limbic system, and in the limbic system is an area called nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is sort of the most important area in making you feel very, very good. So whether it is addiction, if you're addicted to one particular thing and you take it, and the amount of pleasure that you get is because your nucleus accumbens is flooded with dopamine. It is important in gambling. So every time you gamble, that kick that you get is dopamine. And in sex, the anticipation, that pleasure that you get from sex, is because dopamine hits nucleus accumbens. Idea of dopamine being central to sexual pleasure is well known. This has an important corollary in depression. So in depression, what happens is, like especially clinical depression, there is a problem in dopamine pathways. So as soon as there is a problem in dopamine pathways, all the areas where dopamine is supposed to function stops functioning properly. And one of the many aspects in which clinical depression can present is loss of sexual pleasure. And this is very unfortunate, and especially because sometimes this is not dealt with, this is not talked about because of the taboo that is attached to the conversations around sex. Patients with depression, we don't really talk about the sexual aspect much, but very necessary, very important that you do talk about it. There are two important things that I found, very interesting things that I found related to dopamine. If you start seeing someone here and you end up having sex here, your dopamine will keep going up. And you might think that the peak of the dopamine will come at the moment when you have sex, because you're building up towards that. But what is interesting is that dopamine actually peaks here, because dopamine is not just the hormone for pleasure and reward, but it is also the hormone that controls anticipation. which is why the anticipation of sex or the anticipation of any reward feels better than the reward itself. It is, of course, not universally applicable, and there are so many other variables. But what is interesting here is that when they did this experiment on monkey, what they did was they started the experiment here, and the monkey had to push a lever. And after pushing the lever for a specific amount of time, the monkey would get a reward. And they found that the dopamine peaks before the reward, not at the time the monkey gets the reward. And what they then did was they stopped giving the reward every time. They made it only 50% of the time. So every time the monkey would push the lever for a specific number of seconds, now it's not that the reward will come 100% of the time, only half the time the monkey will get the reward. So what happened was the dopamine level actually shot up in anticipation. And this is what neurobiologists called, in layman term, a maybe is more pleasurable than a certainly. So that element of chance, that element of what if something could happen, what if I try and maybe I will get something, that increases anticipation, and that increases dopamine, and that actually increases pleasure. And the neuroscientific term for this is intermittent reinforcement. So this was the first interesting thing that I found as far as dopamine in sex is concerned. The second interesting thing is importance of eye contact. So what they did was they did an experiment where people are looking at faces, different images, and they will rate those people as, yes, I find this person sexually attractive, I don't find this person sexually attractive. So if you show them consistently pictures of people that they are sexually attracted to, now in those people, the pictures where that person is looking right at you, so if there is eye contact, there is more dopamine. And that same person, if they're looking elsewhere, so there is no eye contact, there is less dopamine. So this is the second interesting aspect for dopamine in the context of sex, that eye contact is very important to increase that anticipation.
Hi everyone. If you enjoyed learning neuroscience of sexuality, then do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click that bell icon so that you can get a notification the next time I upload a video. Thank you.